Poor single dad fixed Billionaire's flat tire in the rain. She went silent. When she saw his face, she laughed when he offered to help. Adrienne Vale rolled down the window of her stalled Bentley 2 inches, just enough for her assistant to hear her over the rain, and said, "Tell the gas station worker we'll wait for We don't need charity from someone who probably can't afford his own car." The 2-lane road outside Coldwater, Vermont was empty except for the storm. Sheets of cold November rain hammered the asphalt at 6:14 in the evening, the kind of dark gray that swallowed headlights at 30 feet. Adrienne Vale, 41, founder and CEO of Vale Capital Partners, a private equity firm with $4.8 billion under management, sat in the back seat of her $340 000 Bentley Mulsanne with a flat right rear tire and a cell signal that had died 9 minutes ago. Her assistant, Tasha Bramwell, 28, sat in the passenger seat scrolling her dead phone for the 40th time. Her driver, Henrik, had walked 2 miles back toward the highway to find a signal, leaving the 2 women in a car that was rapidly losing heat. And now, knocking gently on the rear passenger window, was a man in a soaked Carhartt jacket and a worn baseball cap, holding a tire iron and a portable jack. He looked maybe 35, mud on his jeans, cheap work boots. Behind him, a battered Ford F-150 with its hazard lights flashing. "I can change it for you, ma'am." His voice was quiet, polite, used to not being heard. "Won't take 15 minutes. You shouldn't sit out here in this weather." Adrienne didn't even look at him. She spoke to Tasha. "Tell him we're fine. And lock the doors." Tasha rolled down her window 2 inches and offered an apologetic smile. "Thank you so much, but we've got someone coming." "All right." The man nodded once, didn't argue. "I'll wait in my truck until your driver gets back. Don't want to leave you ladies out here alone." He walked back to his F-150, climbed in, and sat there with his hazards on, watching the road. What Adrienne Vale didn't know was that the gas station worker sitting in the rusted pickup behind her was the same man whose face was, at that exact moment, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, sitting in her briefcase. A man she had personally flown to Vermont to recruit. What Tasha didn't know was that within 90 minutes, her boss would be standing in the lobby of a country inn, watching the man in the soaked Carhartt jacket walk down the staircase in a different jacket, holding a 6-year-old daughter on his hip. And her entire body would go still in a way it had never gone still before. But for now, Adrienne just turned back to her tablet, irritated that her evening was being interrupted by a man she'd already decided was beneath her. 3 hours earlier, Caleb Mercer had no idea any of this would happen. He'd been at his daughter's parent-teacher conference at 3 p.m., sitting in a child-sized chair in Mrs. Holloway's first-grade classroom in Coldwater Elementary, listening to a soft-spoken teacher tell him that his daughter Mira was the smartest student she'd taught in 12 years. Mira was reading at a 4th-grade level. She drew pictures of cells and labeled the mitochondria. She had asked, last Tuesday, if Mrs. Holloway had ever read a book called A Brief History of Time. Mrs. Holloway had not. Mira had offered to lend her copy. Caleb had sat in that small chair with his big hands folded and his cheap flannel shirt sleeve hiding a watch that had been his father's, and he had cried, just a little, behind the bill of his cap. He had not been crying because Mira was smart. He had been crying because he was 34 years old and a widower for almost 3 years, and his daughter, his bright, unstoppable, mitochondria-labeling daughter, deserved a school that could keep up with her. Coldwater Elementary couldn't. And he couldn't afford the one that could. Then, he'd driven to the only place in Coldwater that was hiring on a Tuesday in November, the Sinclair gas station on Route 4, and he'd asked Bobby Sinclair if the part-time pump attendant job was still open. Bobby had said yes. $11 an hour. 24 hours a week. Cash under the table on Fridays. Caleb had said, "I'll take it." Bobby had said, "Start Monday." Caleb had walked back out to the F-150 and sat in the driver's seat for a long minute, looking at his hands. 3 years ago, those hands had signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Defense. But that life was over. He had buried it the same week he'd buried his wife. He'd picked up Mira from his sister Joan's house. Joan watched her in the afternoons. Mira was making a paper origami crane in the kitchen, her tongue poking out in concentration. She'd looked up when he came in. "Daddy, did Mrs. Holloway say good things?" "All good things, Bug." "Did she say I was the smartest?" "She said you were the smartest she's seen in 12 years. Mira nodded, satisfied, and went back to her crane. He'd driven her home, made her macaroni from a box, helped her with the homework she'd already finished, read her 2 chapters of Charlotte's Web, and tucked her in at 6 p.m. so Joan could take the late shift watching her. Caleb had promised Bobby he'd come by the station that night to fill out paperwork. He'd kissed Mira's forehead, driven north toward the station. And 10 minutes outside town, on the empty 2-lane that ran past the lake, he'd come around the bend and seen the Bentley pulled half onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, no driver in sight. So he'd stopped, the way his father, a Vermont logger, had taught him to stop. You don't drive past people who need help, Caleb. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter what hour. You stop. Adrian Vale watched the man in the rusted pickup through the rear window of the Bentley and felt nothing in particular. She was annoyed. She was cold. She was 38 hours into a 48-hour trip to Vermont, where she had come, against the advice of her entire executive team, to make an offer to a man she had been hunting for 9 months. His name was Caleb Mercer. She did not know what he looked like. Nobody did. That was the problem. Caleb Mercer had been the lead engineer on a defense contracting project called Atlas Mesh, a battlefield communication system that could reroute itself in real time around jamming, terrain, and signal loss. He had built the core algorithm alone in 14 months, at age 29. The Pentagon had paid the contractor, a firm called Halverson Dynamics, $1.4 billion for the system. Caleb Mercer had been a salaried employee. He had received a bonus check for $40,000 and a handshake. Then his wife, Sarah, had been killed by a hospital infection she'd picked up after a routine surgery. Caleb had walked out of Halverson Dynamics the next week. He had refused all calls, refused all interviews, refused 2 years later to take a meeting with Apple, with Lockheed, with Google, with the Department of Defense itself. Adrian's firm had been retained, quietly, by a consortium of investors who believed Caleb Mercer's next idea, whatever it was, would be worth $10 billion. They had asked Adrian to find him, to convince him, to bring him back. She had located him 3 weeks ago through a stroke of luck, a small-town optometrist's billing system in Coldwater, Vermont, that had been hacked by amateurs and dumped on the dark web. Caleb Mercer, age 34, glasses prescription, Coldwater address, one dependent listed as Mira Mercer, age 6. That was it. No photograph. No social media. No LinkedIn. The man had erased himself. She was driving to Coldwater tonight to find him at his sister's address, Joan Mercer's farmhouse, 2 miles up the lake road from where her tire had just gone flat. She would knock on his sister's door at 7 p.m. and ask, politely but firmly, whether she could speak to her brother. She had practiced the speech in her head for 3 days. She had a $40 million offer in her briefcase. She had also, in her decades of climbing, developed a very precise way of categorizing people on first sight. Money, education, use. The man in the soaked Carhartt jacket had registered, in her trained eye, as none of the three. She did not look at his face when he came back. 20 minutes passed. The rain got harder. Henrik did not come back. Tasha leaned forward. "Adrian, we should let him help. I'm sorry. I know you don't, but we're going to be here for hours, and it's getting really cold." Adrian exhaled. "Fine, tell him we'll pay him." Tasha rolled the window down. The man was already getting out of his truck again, as if he'd been waiting for the cue. He came over without an umbrella, the rain running off the bill of his cap, and bent to look at the tire. "Rear right's blown clean through," he said. "Looks like you ran over something metal. I see a spare in the trunk?" "Yes," Tasha said. "The button's by the driver's seat." He nodded and went to work. 12 minutes. He laid out a small tarp from his truck to keep the lug nuts dry. He used his own jack instead of theirs, because he said the Bentley's factory jack was awkward in the wet. He spun the bolts off and on with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had done this 1,000 times. He did not ask for help. He did not complain about the rain. He did not look at Adrian through the window. When he was finished, he was soaked to the skin. His hands were black with road grime. Tasha had her wallet out, counting bills. "Please," she said, "please take this. $100 for your trouble." The man looked at the money, then at Tasha. He had kind eyes, Tasha noticed for the first time, the kind of eyes that had been tired for a long time. "No, ma'am, I don't take money for helping people." My father would crawl out of his grave, a small smile. "But there's a country inn about 2 miles up the road, the Birch and Maple. If you're driving through, that's the only place with rooms tonight. Storm's gonna get worse." He nodded once. "Drive safe." He walked back to his truck, climbed in, pulled out around them carefully, and disappeared into the rain. Adrienne watched him go. For the first time, she felt something small and sharp move through her chest. Not guilt, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The man had said my father would crawl out of his grave, and she had heard, underneath the words, a particular dignity she had not encountered in a very long time. Not the dignity of money. The other kind. She pushed it away. She had a meeting to keep. What Adrienne didn't know was that the man who had just refused her $100 was the man she was about to offer $40 million. She'd find out. In 90 minutes. The Birch and Maple Inn was a converted farmhouse with cedar siding and a wraparound porch, set back from the road behind a row of maple trees that had gone bare in the wind. Adrienne and Tasha checked in at 6:50 p.m. Dripping, Henrik had found them. Finally, just past the lake. He had called for a tow that wouldn't arrive until morning. The Bentley was parked under the inn's porticocra. They would stay the night. Adrienne would knock on Joan Mercer's door at 8:30 instead of 7, after dinner and a hot shower. She did not think about the gas station worker again. Not consciously. She thought about her pitch. About the $40 million. About how she would frame the equity terms. Generous, almost embarrassingly so, because that was the only language that worked with men who had walked away. She rehearsed the speech in front of the mirror in her room. At 7:40 she came down the carpeted staircase in a dry charcoal sweater and jeans, hair still damp, and stopped on the second-to-last step. A man was walking out of the inn's small dining room with a sleeping child on his hip, 6 years old maybe, brown curly hair. One small hand fisted in the collar of his shirt. The man was wearing a clean flannel and dry boots and a different jacket, a navy fleece, no logo. He was talking quietly to a woman behind the front desk. Joan said she'd come pick her up here. The road past the lake is washed out. I didn't want to drive Mira back through that. Is it okay if we sit by the fire until my sister gets here? Of course, Caleb, you know you can. The innkeeper smiled. Coffee? Please. He turned slightly, adjusting the child on his hip, and his face came into the light of the lobby chandelier. Adrienne went still. It was him, the man from the rain. But it wasn't just that. She knew his face. She had seen it before. She had seen it on the cover of the Wall Street Journal in 2021, in a profile she had pulled from the archives 9 months ago, because the article was the only photograph in existence of the engineer who had built Atlas Mesh. The photo had been small, grainy, taken from a distance at a Pentagon ceremony he hadn't wanted to attend. She had stared at it for an hour. She had memorized the line of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the small scar over the left eyebrow, because she had told herself she would recognize him if she ever saw him. She had not recognized him in the rain, because she had not looked. Caleb Mercer was standing 15 feet away from her, holding his sleeping daughter, asking the innkeeper for a cup of coffee. The lobby was quiet. Tasha had not yet come down. The innkeeper stepped into the back to make the coffee. Caleb crossed the lobby slowly so as not to wake his daughter, lowered himself into the leather armchair by the fireplace, and settled the child against his chest. Mira sighed in her sleep and burrowed into his collar. Adrienne could not move. She watched him from the staircase for what felt like a long time. She watched the way his hand cradled the back of his daughter's head. She watched the small frown of concentration on his face as he made sure the child's legs were tucked under the blanket. She watched a man who had 3 years ago written the most consequential battlefield algorithm in 20 years, and who tonight had refused her $100 and changed her tire in the rain because his father would have crawled out of his grave. And she felt then the things she had pushed away in the car. She felt ashamed. It was not a feeling Adrienne Vale was accustomed to. She had built a career on not feeling it. She had told herself, somewhere around her 30th birthday, that shame was a tool used by smaller people to keep larger people in line, and she had refused to be small. She had been very effective at it for 11 years. But here, on a carpeted staircase in a country inn in November, watching a man hold his sleeping child by a fire she had not earned the right to share, she felt it. It moved through her like cold water. She put her hand on the banister. She thought about saying something. She thought about turning around and going back to her room. She thought about Tasha coming down and seeing her like this, frozen on a staircase, and asking what was wrong. She did none of it. She just stood there. Caleb looked up. Their eyes met across the lobby. He recognized her instantly. She saw it. The small flicker, the slight tightening around his eyes, not anger, just recognition. He had known who she was the whole time, of course. He had not changed her tire as a stranger. He had changed it as the man whose face she had not bothered to look at. He did not say anything. He just looked at her, calmly, the way a man holds an animal still with his eyes. Then, he gave her one small nod, not friendly, not hostile. The nod of a man who had taken her measure on the side of a road in the rain and had decided already what he thought of her. Adrienne came the rest of the way down the stairs. She crossed the lobby. She stopped 6 feet from his chair, careful not to wake the child. She did not know what she was going to say until she said it. Mr. Mercer. Her voice came out lower than she'd intended. My name is Adrienne Vale. I owe you an apology. A serious one. I would like to give it to you properly. Tomorrow morning, when your daughter isn't sleeping on you, and when I have had time to think about exactly what I want to say, if you would let me. He looked at her for a long moment. You came to Vermont to find me, he said. It was not a question. Yes, you had a pitch. Yes, you can keep it. He said it without heat. I'm not for sale. I haven't been for 3 years. I'm not going to be. She nodded. I understand. That isn't what I'm asking for. I'm asking for 10 minutes tomorrow to apologize for what I said in the car, not for the business, for the rudeness. Caleb studied her. The fire cracked. 8 a.m., he said finally. Here in the lobby. 10 minutes. After that, I have to take my daughter to school. Thank you. She turned to walk away. Miss Vale, she stopped. My father used to say that a person's character is what they do when they think nobody important is watching. He shifted Mira gently. You weren't rude because you thought I was beneath you. You were rude because you thought I didn't matter. Those aren't the same thing. The first one is a mistake. The second one is a habit. If you want to apologize for something real, apologize for the habit. Adrienne stood very still. 8 a.m., she said quietly. 8 a.m. She walked back across the lobby and up the stairs. She did not look back. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the small chair by the window of her room and watched the rain stop and the moon come out over the lake. And she thought about a man holding his daughter by a fire. She thought about the $100 he had refused. She thought about the algorithm he had written alone in 14 months at 29. She thought about her own father, who had died of liver disease when she was 12, in a trailer outside Bakersfield, and who had once, when she was 9 years old, fixed a stranger's truck in the rain, because that's what you do, Addie. She had not thought about that memory in 26 years. She had buried it the same way Caleb Mercer had buried his old life. She had built a fortress of expensive things over the top of it. She watched the moon. She thought about the word habit. At 7:50 a.m., she came down the stairs in a simple sweater and no makeup, and sat in the leather chair across from his. Mira was at school, dropped off by Joan, whose farmhouse was apparently a quarter-mile back down the road on a route that was no longer washed out. Caleb was drinking coffee and reading the paper. He folded it when he saw her. 10 minutes, he said. Yes, she took a breath. I'm not going to make you a pitch. I want to say what I came down here to say. I was raised by a man who would have done exactly what you did last night. He died when I was 12. I spent the next 29 years building a career designed to make sure I never felt as small as he did. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that the thing I admired about him was not that he survived. It was that he stopped for people. He stopped for strangers in the rain. He didn't have a habit of looking past people. I do. You named it correctly last night. I am sorry. Caleb watched her over his coffee. Okay, he said. That was all. She nodded. She stood. Thank you for changing my tire. She turned to go. Miss Vale, she stopped again. He set down the coffee. If you ever come back to Vermont, don't come to recruit me. I meant what I said. But if you come back, to fish or to see the leaves, or for any other reason, you can stop by Joan's place. She runs a small bakery on Saturdays. You can buy a pie. We'll say hello. Adrienne Vale, who had not cried in front of another human being since she was 12 years old, found her eyes burning. I would like that, she said. She drove back to New York that afternoon. What happened next did not happen the way Adrienne would have predicted 6 months earlier. The $40 million offer was withdrawn. The consortium of investors was furious. Adrienne told them, in a board meeting, that Caleb Mercer was not for sale, and that anyone who tried to pressure him further would be doing so without her firm. 3 of the 4 investors pulled their accounts. They represented 18% of Vale Capital Partners' assets under management. It was the worst quarter of her career. She did not particularly mind. She made one phone call, 3 weeks later, to a woman named Dr. Helen Whitcomb, who ran a small, fiercely competitive private K-12 academy in Hanover, New Hampshire, a school with a national reputation for accelerating gifted children and a tuition that ran $52,000 a year. Adrienne asked Dr. Whitcomb whether the school had a scholarship endowment for rural students. Dr. Whitcomb said it did not. Adrienne said she would like to establish one, anonymously, for one student per year from a Vermont public school district, beginning with the current academic year. The endowment was $4 million. It would generate enough income to fund one full tuition scholarship in perpetuity, plus transportation, books, and a stipend for any necessary tutoring. The only condition was that the first scholarship be awarded based on Dr. Whitcomb's independent academic assessment, with no input from the donor, to a child who had been identified by her teachers as exceptionally gifted, but unable to afford the school. Adrienne provided no names. She did not need to. Dr. Whitcomb's office, 3 weeks later, contacted a first-grade teacher in Coldwater, Vermont, named Mrs. Holloway, who had recently written a recommendation letter for a student named Mira Mercer. Mira began 2nd grade at Whitcomb Academy the following September. Caleb drove her there twice a week and homeschooled her the other 3 days from the small farmhouse he and Joan had bought together with the proceeds of his Atlas Mesh bonus, which had been sitting in a savings account for 3 years. Mira had a scholarship. Caleb never learned who funded it. Dr. Whitcomb honored the anonymity clause for the rest of her career. A year passed. On a Saturday in late September, a woman in a simple cardigan and a pair of jeans walked into Joan Mercer's bakery in Coldwater, Vermont. She bought a maple pie and a loaf of sourdough. She paid in cash. She did not introduce herself. She said the leaves were beautiful this year, and Joan agreed. On her way back to her rental car, she stopped on the sidewalk. A man was loading a toolbox into the bed of an old Ford F-150. He looked up. Their eyes met across the parking lot. Caleb nodded once, not friendly, not hostile. Then he smiled, just a little, and lifted one hand in a small wave. Adrienne lifted hers back. She got in her car. She drove south. The road past the lake had been repaved. She kept her windows down, even though the air was cold, and she listened to the wind move through the maples that were just beginning to turn gold at the tops. And for the first time in 29 years, she thought about her father, not as a man she had to escape, but as a man she had a chance still to honor. Behind her, in the small bakery on the corner of Route 4, Joan Mercer pulled another pie out of the oven and slid it onto the cooling rack, and her brother carried a child-sized pair of muddy boots inside from the porch. And a 6-year-old girl who could read at a 4th grade level sat at the kitchen table drawing a picture of a mitochondrion in a notebook she had brought home from a school in New Hampshire. The rain, when it came that evening, was gentle.